These are 10 mistakes to watch out for when growing your online community. So, with number one, we have a lack of a clear purpose. Failing to define a clear purpose or vision for your community will likely lead to confusion amongst members. On top of the confusion, members may begin to invent their own purpose for what your community entails, which is not a good outcome because, with everyone having a different idea of what your community is, no one will be united by a common purpose, which ultimately defeats the idea of having a community altogether. The idea here is that you want prospective community members to know what they're getting into before they even arrive at your community. The purpose needs to be defined. Of course, your community will evolve over time. That's organic, that's natural, and in fact, that's something that you should want, is for your community to indeed evolve and change for the better over time. But as it stands, before or in the initial stages of building your community, you need to have a central purpose or theme that your community surrounds, and that needs to be communicated and made clear for all of its members to see. Because again, if this doesn't happen, you're going to have members who are going to begin to create their own idea of what the purpose of your community is, which isn't ideal because, of course, if dozens of people have conflicting ideas of what the purpose of your community is, no one will be united by a common vision, a common mission that your community seeks to accomplish for its members. Moving on. The second mistake that you might be making is overlooking the onboarding process. So don't allow new members to simply join your community space without any further elaboration on what's to come. A new member's path forwards must be made evident in a series of clear, actionable steps that aim to fulfill their transformative journey. Now, if you aren't familiar with what the onboarding process entails with regards to establishing an online community, the onboarding process basically consists of the initial steps when a new member joins. What are those steps? And of course, that changes from community to community depending on the different goals and visions for the various communities out there. But there is, of course, some overlap and indeed good practices when it comes to effective online community onboarding. Regardless, it's important that you, as the community builder and or manager, define a set of clear, actionable steps that a member must commit to as soon as they join. And a good way to make the onboarding process as clear and as robust as possible is to have some kind of orientation slash onboarding course. And where I work in the online community, Cal's Country Club, KCC for short here, there is indeed an orientation slash onboarding course wherein the community builder in question explains to new members what their first steps entail. And in terms of examples of what first steps could be for a given member, that can be anywhere from, say, example, making an introductions post wherein they introduce themselves and talk and answer a few questions, and indeed existing community members can begin to familiarize themselves with these new members upon making an introductions post. And other onboarding steps could consist of, for example, setting up their profile or doing any number of things that you as a community builder and or manager deem as crucial or critical or important for new members to commit to as far as actionable steps are concerned. Now, moving on to the third potential mistake that you might be making in growing your online community, which is not engaging with new members as soon as possible. You don't want new members' first impressions being that of rejection or presuming that your community space is an inactive wasteland. Take proactive steps to engage with newcomers by commenting on their posts and asking them questions, which in turn make them feel acknowledged and valued. This deliberate effort fosters a welcoming atmosphere and encourages new members to actively participate and contribute. This particular point is really just a lesson in establishing a positive feedback loop. The worst thing, in fact, the opposite of this would be a negative feedback loop wherein a new member joins. Let's say they make, for example, their first post, which they put a lot of effort and attention into, and it just falls on deaf ears. Nobody's commenting, nobody's liking it, nobody's giving it any attention in any way, shape, or form. And that, of course, forms a negative feedback loop. That member no longer wants to participate, that member no longer wants to invest so much time and energy into creating some kind of valuable post for it to only fall upon deaf ears. And so in order to mitigate that, as far as you being a community builder and or manager, it's up to you, especially in the early stages of your community where there's not a lot of members or there's not a core culture, a strong core culture that has developed. It's up to you to try to comment or ask questions and engage with these new members' posts as soon as you can in order to create a positive feedback loop wherein new members are actually incentivized and acknowledged for the value that they bring to the table. Moving on to the fourth community building mistake that you might be committing to, which is limiting the onboarding process. So avoid assuming that the onboarding process solely caters to a member's initial days in your online community. Recognize that a robust onboarding sequence should extend into the future, guiding members with long-term commitments they need to make in order to realize the transformation that your community promises. Onboarding establishes the groundwork, outlining a comprehensive roadmap from joining the community, which you can consider as point A, all the way to achieving the desired transformation, point Z. So typically when community builders establish an onboarding sequence for new members, they focus entirely on the first day or the first few days of a member's presence in their online community, which is not a bad thing to do. In fact, that's the right thing to do. But oftentimes these community builders overlook the fact that an onboarding sequence can extend out into the future. And this is especially relevant for communities who promise or offer a transformation that occurs on a long-term timeline. What I mean by that is you can have online communities that are centered around themes such as self-help or fitness and other educational spaces, wherein these are long-term commitments. You cannot build a body, say, in a fitness context within one day upon engaging with all the course materials, say, in your online community that is themed around fitness. No, that can take years to accomplish some kind of physical transformation. So if your community is a fitness one, for example, and it promises some kind of physical transformation, that's not going to happen in the first day, and that's not going to happen in the first few days. But what you can do is provide a series of steps that extend far out into the future. So you can provide a series of steps that go out into 6 months or even years to come. And that is a supplementation, that is the follow-up, the next steps after the onboarding sequence. So don't limit the onboarding sequence to simply a first day or first week affair. Make sure to provide the next steps in a member's journey, because indeed after a member has completed all of the onboarding requirements, he's going to want to know what he has to do next within the context of your community. So it's important that you provide long-term steps as well that add to the onboarding process. Now, moving on to the next community building mistake that you might be making, which is having too many rules. An abundance of rules often leads to analysis paralysis among members as the sheer volume of information becomes overwhelming. While you might believe that many rules are necessary for maintaining order in your community, most effective community guidelines consist of a handful of impactful rules, such as those concerning respect, that are then complemented by a series of strong recommendations. These recommendations are valuable suggestions for members to consider, but they do not carry the weight of the essential rules. Note that while recommendations are indeed useful, they should not be presented as mandatory rules because excessive rules can become a burden for members to remember. And in an effort to prioritize convenience, you should ideally strive to maintain no more than 3 key rules for members to adhere to. To put this more into detail, let's say, for example, you join an online community space and you're unfamiliar with it and you need to learn the rules and codes of conduct / guidelines of this space. It would be a lot to ask of you to remember an entire list, a plethora of dozens upon dozens of rules, which perhaps even have overlap between them. So the gist here is if there's a way to whittle down to its core as many rules as you possibly can so that you have, let's say, ideally three, which is easier to remember than more than three, than a dozen, than a plethora of rules to consider, then by all means go down that route and make things as simple as possible for new members to consider. What I've noticed when studying other online communities is oftentimes community builders will package strong recommendations as rules. And this isn't to knock on strong recommendations, they absolutely have a place, but they have a place as recommendations and not as mandatory rules. So when it comes to establishing the rules for your community, make sure that you're providing rules and not rules supplemented with strong recommendations. You can have the strong recommendations somewhere else in your community, but as far as the rules are concerned, you should limit them to a small amount that are easier to remember and that are high leverage and high impact in of themselves. Moving on. Creating too many categories. You'll know which categories to delete based on their level of engagement, which is not a one-size-fits-all rule due to lurkers and management-helmed categories amongst other potential factors. What I mean by categories is in a community, in an online community, typically you have the forum feed, which is for text-based posts. And in those forum feeds, they are often divided into categories or subforums or subtopics. And oftentimes I've noticed in people's online communities is they have way too many categories or subforums for its own good. It spreads the conversation out too thin in their community, and it's just too much to consider. It's too much of a visual mess. And again, it just spreads out the conversation too thin in the community. And oftentimes categories have a ton of overlap when people have too many of them. So it's important that you limit these subcategories or subforms, whatever you want to call them, into the smallest amount possible, so that again, you're not spreading out the conversation too thin in your community, and so that it's not only aesthetically more pleasing to look at as there's less clutter, but it's also more easy to interact with as it's more streamlined and simple and focused. Another mistake people make is not considering lurkers. Put simply, there may be a considerable number of members in your community who seem inactive because they don't participate through posts, comments, attending live calls, etc. However, they might still enjoy your community space by reading posts, watching courses, etc. Therefore, don't conclude that a seemingly inactive member isn't enjoying what your community has on offer. However, it's crucial to avoid using the potential existence of lurkers in your community as a justification for a genuinely inactive space. This is just to remind you that lurkers are often overlooked when assessing community engagement metrics. This point has to be made because oftentimes when people are evaluating their online community for engagement metrics, for activity, they might consider that, oh, well, it seems that, for example, let's say if there's a community of 100 members, they realize that only 50 are seemingly active. But what they're oftentimes overlooking is the presence of a lurker. And a lurker in the context of an online community is a member who doesn't actively participate. He doesn't post, he doesn't comment, he doesn't attend live calls, whatever it may be. But that doesn't mean that he isn't active. He's active in the sense that he's reading the posts, watching the courses, and he's indeed having a good time. He's just not a member that chooses to participate, and that's his prerogative. It might be an online community, so there might be a sense, or there may be a predisposition for people to want to network and communicate amongst each other, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be some members who prefer to be a little less active than others in terms of the traditional engagement metrics. So if ever you see in your community that there are inactive members, they might not actually be as inactive as you think they are. They might just be lurkers. But I left my note there simply because you do not want to use this particular point as a crutch or excuse for genuine inactivity in your community. If your community is seeing very little engagement across the board, then don't just assume that it's because you have a bunch of lurkers. At the end of the day, like I said previously, a community is a social affair, whether in person or online. So at the end of the day, you're going to want to have the vast majority of your members being visibly active and to have a small amount of members who are lurkers. That would be the ideal ratio to maintain. Next up, we have community management burnout. Running an online community isn't just about setting it once and letting it run on autopilot. Despite being portrayed as a convenient business model with the promise of recurring subscription revenue, building and managing an online community is far from an effortless enterprise. Advocates of community building often purport it as an ideal business model without elaborating on the continuous dedication it demands. As such, this oversight can lead to burnout for those managing the community. To alleviate this burden, you might consider hiring virtual assistants, that is, community managers, to help share the responsibilities. So, a lot of people before building a community or in the early stages have this notion that it's an easy business model to build and to maintain, which couldn't be further from the truth. A lot of people think that it can be a one-man mission wherein the community builder builds it and maintains it for its entire existence. And if you go into building a community with this expectation, you're going to be really surprised, because this is something that you have to upkeep almost every single day. And if this is something that you're earning money from, say, monthly, that means that you have to constantly upgrade, you have to constantly add value to this product or service every single month. So this is not something that you set up once and let run on autopilot. This is something that demands your attention almost every single day, pretty much every single day, if you really want to build a great community atmosphere. And if you're doing that alone, that indeed can lead to burnout on your part. So in that regard, it's important that you outsource some of the work, some of the responsibilities to other virtual assistants, mainly community managers, to help you out in that regard. Now, moving on to community member burnout. Likewise, too much activity can cause burnout in members. Therefore, don't bombard your members with too many rules, events, etc. Deliver a stream of content and responsibilities at a frequency that they are comfortable with. For example, in KCC, which is the online community that I work in, an end-of-the-month survey revealed that members primarily valued the community for its courses over the other content. As such, we increased our focus on creating courses, while reducing the frequency of the live calls. This point is important to consider, as you may inadvertently be allocating undue attention to community features that, while appreciated, are not the primary draw for the majority of your community members. So if you haven't already, it's super important that as a community builder and or manager, you supply some kind of survey or form to your members to really understand why they're actually in your community, what they actually value, and why they joined it. And what we discovered in the particular online community that I work in is that the vast majority of members joined because they wanted access to the courses. They didn't necessarily want the calls. Of course, they wanted the calls, and it was appreciated and something that they attended and were interested in. But for them, the number one draw, the main priority for them, was accessing the online courses. And as such, this gave us the allowance to limit the number of live calls, which indeed were time consuming, to then focus that time and energy and focus on building and providing a bunch of online courses. So for you, you might be actually investing tons of energy and attention into areas of your community that your members may not necessarily be there for. So that's important that you assess what your members are actually in your community for on a regular basis and adjust accordingly. And in terms of this relating to member burnout, this is just to say that you might be giving your members too much of something that they don't want and they're getting tired of it. So it's important to really assess what they're in this for, so that you're not burning them out, and indeed that you're not burning out your own resources, time, energy, and attention, providing things that aren't the biggest priority for the majority of your members. And next up, we have ignoring member feedback. And this ties into the previous point. So building and operating an online community isn't a top-down operation. as a community, everyone's in this to ensure each other's mutual welfare. And as far as actionable steps are in this regard to actually assess member feedback, you can include things such as forms, surveys, or just asking for feedback on a consistent basis. For example, in the community that I work in, the community builder will typically bounce ideas off members before implementing them. And this doesn't have to be in the most formal of ways. You can just create a very quick post just being like, hey guys, I had this idea. What do you think of this? Would this be something that you guys are interested in? And you can just sort of bounce ideas off members before even implementing them, because the worst thing that can happen is that you spend ample time, energy, and attention creating some kind of feature, course, or planning some kind of live call, for example, only for members to not actually really have wanted it in the first place. So again, this ties into the previous point, but it could be a point in of its own, in the sense that you really want to get members' feedback and you really want to adjust accordingly with it. And with that, thank you for watching this video.